Hey guys, welcome back to Primer Podcast. Back this week with another week of Kingdom Confusion.
Absolutely.
Looking into Matthew 6. So what is that? What are we looking at this week?
Yeah, we're looking at a passage that I think is familiar to many of us, but it's in Matthew chapter 6, and it's well, it carries all through the end of 5 into 6 really, but Jesus has this statement that really sticks out in verse 25. He says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life." And it's a really simple statement, but then you kind of dive into it. There's a lot of meat on these bones, right? This is a pretty challenging call to action. What does it mean to not worry about my life at all? And he's going to talk about the birds, the sparrows, and the birds of the field, and the lilies, and use those as examples of God's provision for these things that don't worry. And he's going to call us to embody that same spirit.
Yeah, and it talks specifically about don't worry what you will eat or drink, about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food. But yet, I think of this and I think about the way that I have worried in my past, whether it's, whether I will have, enough money to go and get my children clothes for the next year or whatever. Never really we never struggled in that sense, but in some ways, but then really just recently I think about, those that are in the mountains and they are worried about food and water. And so, but the more I think about this, and then I mentioned to you earlier about, I was thinking about this, but then also I was a little bit all right, Jesus, you're telling us not to worry, but yet there is worry in our lives. And so the thought of, someone, just for instance, this weekend, our son and our daughter-in-law are in Waynesville. And so not talking to them for, 30 hours or so, and not knowing where they were, not knowing what was going on, and you're hearing.
I was worried, and they weren't my kids.
Right. Yeah. And so that's where I think my biggest question, and usually when I question Jesus, he usually eventually, some of the words come to me and realize, okay, it's the peace when we take it to God.
Yeah.
It's when he's telling us not to worry. And it's not that he's saying we don't have anything to worry about. Mm-hmm. It's more of, if we go to God, he'll bring you an unspeakable peace over you. Yeah. And that, I experienced that while we were waiting for Zach and Jocelyn to contact us. And so the peace that I felt it was not that the worry was gone. Yeah. It was just knowing that I knew Jesus. And I knew that he provides for us, and whatever the outcome was.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot of insight there, because I'm a worrier, definitely. I think that I regularly see myself kind of spiral in what ifs and question marks, in particular around my kids and protecting them and those kind of things. But I think it's important anytime we read these passages, again, to remember that context and remember who's Jesus is talking to. And so he's talking to these 4 groups of people that we've talked about: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and the Essenes. And each of them have these kingdom confusions that have led them to these idols. And it's interesting, because if you look in that passage at the statements that immediately precede this piece of worry, you can almost identify a paragraph or a stanza that's talking to the worry that comes from each of their confused kingdoms, right? There's this conversation about how we pray and how we fast, and it's pointing to this Pharisaical, fixation and distortion upon, perfect action and right action. And you look at there's a piece about treasure and money, and you point to the Sadducees there. There's this piece about that Nick talked about last week about loving our enemies, right?
Yeah.
And that's going to speak to the Zealots. And then there's this piece about food and provision and clothing that's going to speak to the Essenes, who are trying to keep that comfortable life. And what I find interesting is that I think what Jesus is trying to identify is that our worry oftentimes is a symptom of a confused kingdom. And when we're consumed with worry about our financial well-being or our comfort or our religious behaviors or our political systems, that worry should be a red flag for us. It should be a reminder that, hey, maybe my hope is not in God's kingdom here. And so I think you're absolutely right. There are going to be times where there's just natural worry, right? When we recognize that hey, I've lost contact with my child for 30 hours in the midst of generational flooding, right? And but then there are other spaces where we have the same worry that sounds very similar, that's tied to really this kingdom confusion and this symptom. And I think that's what Jesus is really kind of leaning on here. And I think, Paul really is going to be an embodiment of some of that, where there are circumstances that Paul should be worried in, and yet he's not, So we see that all throughout the book of Philippians too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The Philippians 4 was something that I when I was struggling with this do not worry, I went to the Philippians 4 of do not be anxious.
Yeah, about anything.
Yeah. And it really, to be honest, it kind of brings you peace when you look at it, which is saying the same thing. It's just showing you that God brings you the peace.
Yeah.
If you go to Him in your worry and
Paul's in prison at the time, and he's facing potential death. Right. That if there's ever a time to worry, that's it. And he's not. And it's interesting because I think in a lot of ways, what Jesus is inviting us to is like kind of this alternate reality. Like this worry that we have points to the reality that we're still motivated. Our eyes are still set on our kingdom. And so, I think a lot of times we have this idea or this prayer that, like, if I put my trust in Jesus, if I put my hope in Jesus, if I surrender my life to Jesus, then I'll receive this protection. Mm-hmm. Then I'll be comfortable. I'll have enough food for tomorrow. I'll have enough money for tomorrow. I'll have enough protection and safety for tomorrow. That my candidate will be elected. All of these different things, right? And what is that saying? Like, it's saying that my trust in Jesus is dependent upon this worldly outcome, which means my eyes are still fixed on this worldly outcome. And I think Jesus is going to speak to that in this passage, because he's going to invite us in verse 33 to recognize whatever our worry is rooted to, whatever that confused kingdom, that distorted view is, there's one solution to our sickness here. It says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Right? It's this idea that, like, what if we lived in a reality that we were so drawn to the kingdom of God that we lost our appetite for the things of this world. Mm-hmm. Right? So it wasn't a question of, will I have enough food for tomorrow? Will I have enough money in my 401k? Will I be able to live in this comfortable home? Will I have done all it's just this space of, like, as long as I have God, I have all that I need. Yeah. Right? And that's a very different challenge in comparison to kind of the kingdom confusions of our world.
Yeah, it's a I think when you continue to look at what Jesus is saying, when you take out the word worry and almost replace it with something that is provided, and the peace that God provides, when you are looking to Him and not the world to provide. Right. And so I think that a lot of times And we've talked about this before, is don't just look at a few verses, continue to read is so important as well. And because like if we just kind of stopped at the what shall we wear, but what you just read in 33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, that brings it all back together and pointing straight to God. And most of the time we tend to look towards the world to provide, whether it's worry, something that will take away my worry. I tend to, go to the news or something like that, rather than going to God. And so I mentioned to you before, as soon as I sat down, I had to quiet, go away. Once I heard the news that we still had not heard from Zach, and I had to go away and be alone with God. And there came this piece of like, the news, the people around me are not going to provide what I truly need, is that peace. And God provided it for a period of time to where it was a unmistakable peace over me that only was provided by God in that time. And so I continued to look for answers in the world. And so
I mean, I think that speaks to this idea that it's like, what are you hungry for? Is it my way? Is it the answer to my prayer? Or is it this peace that can be rooted only in the kingdom of heaven? And obviously you're experiencing that, or we're thankfully experiencing that. Zach and Jocelyn are doing well, and they're good. That probably needs to be stated.
Yeah, that's true.
But at the same time, it was like what you needed in that moment was that peace that's rooted in Jesus. And while that's an extreme example, how much more is that relevant to us when we think about, again, that raise that we want, or we think about that thing that we want to purchase, or we think about this political season where it's this space where how many of us are praying that this candidate or another is elected, and so our perspective on the kingdom is rooted to an earthly outcome. And so what if our prayers instead were, God, regardless of what happens in this space, give me a firm foundation and trust in your sovereignty, that you are on the throne, and regardless of the outcome, that can't be shaken, that can't be taken from us, because ultimately, if it's rooted to the outcomes of this world, eventually that's going to erode. Eventually we're going to say, well, God, maybe you're not there, because you're not. I've been faithful to you. I've prayed to you. I've done these things, but you didn't answer in the ways of my kingdom. And so perhaps your kingdom is not there at all. Instead, looking at people like Paul, which from the perspective of the world, he met Jesus and his life, tumbled. It just fell off the map, right? He's this successful, driven, wealthy, Sadducee at this time, and suddenly, or Pharisee at this time, and suddenly he meets Jesus, and now he's being beaten, he's imprisoned, he's impoverished, he doesn't have anything to his name. Like, by the kingdoms of the world, God hasn't shown up for him.
Right.
And yet, I think Paul would articulate this deep sense of peace and the sovereignty of God. And I think that's our challenge too.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys can dig a little deeper into chapter 6 and kind of talk with your group and maybe be vulnerable on your worry of what it is that brings you worry, and talk more intimately in your groups. We'll see you next week.
See you soon.